Good morning, grade 4s, and welcome to Natural Science. This is the very first time that you are meeting me today. My name is Miss Kun, and I'm very excited to teach you science for the next couple of lessons. So before we begin, I firstly wanted to ask, how are all of you doing? I know that it's not that easy still being at home, but it is the safest option. But we are here, and I am here specifically to make sure that you still continue learning and you just have fun with learning about science. Now, remember that these lessons are brought to you by WorksheetCloud, and remember that if you have any questions with anything with this lesson, please remember to email all of your queries to grade4@worksheetcloud.com. Okay, are you ready to see what we are going to learn today? Let's get started. So today we are specifically going to learn about living and non-living things. We are starting a brand new section in science, and we are going to be learning all about life and living, which is wonderful because life and living is all around us. And today specifically, we're going to kick it off with looking at what are the differences between living and non-living things, as well as how to identify them. Okay, so our lesson objectives for today, I'm going to introduce you to Mrs. Gren. She is a lovely lady, and she's going to give you some tips and advice on how to differentiate between living and non-living things. Then we are going to look at reviving organisms. Thirdly, we are going to look at changing from living to non-living. And then to end off today's lesson, I'm going to do an activity with you just to sort of wrap things up. Are you ready? Okay. So, grade 4s, I would like to introduce you to Mrs. Gren. As you can see, she's a lovely lady, and she has got some very wise words of wisdom. Now, Mrs. Gren is actually an acronym which every letter of her particular name stands for a certain thing. So, if we have a look at Mrs. Gren, the first letter is an M, which is movement. The second letter is reproduction with the R. S is sensitivity. G is growth. The second R is respiration. E, excretion, and N, nutrition. Now, some of these words, some of you probably have heard before, and some of you maybe this is the very first time that you are hearing these words for the first time. But it's okay. I'm going to go through the meaning of each of these words, how they are tied into living and non-living things. Okay, now Mrs. Gren is very special because we use Mrs. Gren whenever we look at an object and we think to ourselves, is this particular object living or is it non-living? And Mrs. Gren is there to help us go through all of the different sort of checklists to see, does this object move, reproduce, is it sensitive, does it grow, does it respire, does it excrete, and does it have nutrition? Okay, so now we're going to go through each one specifically. So I'm going to start with movement. Now, all of us move as humans. We know that we move. We move our arms, we move our legs. So specifically, humans and animals use their bodies to move from one place to the next. Now, with all of these different parts of Mrs. Gren, I'm specifically going to talk about how Mrs. Gren is related to both plants as well as animals, and how every part of Mrs. Gren, we are going to look at an example of how plants use it as well as animals. So with movement, remember that an object or an organism or something can only be classified as living if it is able to move. So as I mentioned before, humans and animals move. We move all the time, and plants also move. Now you probably think, but how do plants move? Plants don't have arms or legs. They can't just get up and start walking. However, plants do interestingly enough, the moment that there is sunlight, they do sort of grow towards the light and they move towards either light, or the roots in the water, the roots in the ground grow towards water. Also, many stems also grow upwards. As you know, plants do grow, and as they grow, they also move as they grow as well. So that is the first aspect of Mrs. Gren. An organism has to be able to move if it is living. Moving on to the first R of Mrs. Gren. Organisms have to be able to reproduce. Now, if we specifically look at humans and animals produce offspring. And remember, many different animals, either animals, depending on what class of animal they are, some animals give birth to live young, some animals lay eggs. Different animals, depending on what class of animal they are, they have to reproduce and make more copies of themselves in order to continue their species. If we look at plants, some new plants can grow from seeds and other plants can grow from cuttings or shoots. Now, this is quite interesting, and I actually do this all the time sometimes. When you take a cutting, so it can be a leaf of certain plants, and you actually put that leaf in water, or the stem itself, then leave it in water and roots actually start to grow. And that's what we call when plants grow from cuttings. So there are two different ways that plants reproduce, which is very cool. I bet some of you didn't even know that. Okay, so far, just to recap, organisms that are classified as living have to be able to move, and secondly, have to be able to reproduce. The third aspect of Mrs. Gren is our S, which is sensitivity. Now, when I talk about sensitivity, I don't mean that organisms have to be sensitive. And when we say sensitive, sensitive to feelings. That's not at all what I'm talking about. When we talk about sensitivity, all living things respond to changes in their environment and then they react to them. So if something happens around them in their particular environment, they then react to it and make sort of certain changes. So let's specifically look at how animals and humans do it, and then how we look at how plants show sensitivity. Okay, so when it is really cold outside, especially since I know that winter is coming up, and I don't know about you, but I'm not a fan of winter. I get cold very easily. And when I'm cold, because of the outside temperature and because of the changes in weather, I go into my cupboard and I put a nice warm jacket on and possibly a scarf and a beanie just to keep me warm. Now, because I am reacting to the outside weather, I am then said to be sensitive. Okay. Also, if it is a really hot day, now today is a beautiful day, it's quite warm, and if I go stand outside in the sun, I eventually then get too hot. So I will then move into the shade, and I'm reacting to the weather by moving into the shade or coming inside or putting on a hat or an umbrella to just shield and protect me from the sun. So I'm responding to the outside weather. Now, other types of animals, such as reptiles. Now, reptiles are cold-blooded creatures. Now, what we mean by that, and I'm sure you'll learn this more in detail a little bit later on, but reptiles aren't able to actually regulate their own body temperature. Reptiles, interestingly enough, are different to mammals, because mammals, we are warm-blooded, which means we've got a constant body temperature of around 37 degrees Celsius, whereas reptiles, they aren't able to keep a constant body temperature. They aren't able to regulate their body temperature. So what do? Well, when it is a beautiful sunny day, the reptiles usually will go and bask in the sun to absorb as much energy and heat and warmth from the sun as possible to keep them nice and warm. I'm sure you have all seen lizards. that crawl out from rocks or out of crevices, and you'll see these lizards that bask in the sun and they just enjoy the sunlight. And so that's, and we say that reptiles are also sensitive, just like all animals. Now, if we have a look at plants, now, how do plants react to their outside environment? How are plants sensitive? Well, funnily enough, when we change seasons from summer into autumn, just before winter, what happens to the leaves on the trees? Well, as the temperature starts to drop, the leaves start to change color. And I'm sure all of you have seen the different shades of autumn colors, the oranges and the browns and the yellows. They're actually a beautiful range of colors that the leaves turn. And the leaves start to change color, and eventually they fall off the tree, and the trees then survive throughout winter, and they just wait for spring and the beautiful weather or the temperature to start picking up so that spring can occur. Flowers also react to the light, and they open up when it is light, and when it is dark, flowers do start to sort of close a little bit. It's quite interesting. So that is how plants are sensitive, and how humans and animals are also sensitive. Remember, a living organism can only be classified if it's classified as living if it is also sensitive. Okay, fourth thing is that all living organisms need to be able to grow. If an organism doesn't grow and age per se over time, it's not classified as living. So if we specifically look at humans, we know that babies and young adults grow and get older. And as you can see from my picture on the screen, starting off with babies, get old into a teenager, an adult, and then age into a grandpa or granny. And we have the circle of life, but organisms have to be able to grow. Just like with plants, seedlings grow into plants. So we start off with a little seedling, a seed grows into a seedling, and eventually becomes a full-blown plant. And so all living organisms have to be able to grow. Okay, so just to recap, I'm going to pause right there. M is for movement, yes. R for Mrs. The first R is for reproduction, good. S is for sensitivity. It is a long word, so practice your spelling, because remember, spelling is also very important in science. And G is for growth. Okay, moving on, looking at our second R. Right. All living organisms have to be able to respire, and respiration has to take place. Now, what on earth does respiration mean? Okay, now respiration, either this word you have heard before or you've never heard this word in your life before. Now, all living things have to use oxygen in the air to convert food into energy. Now, if we specifically look at humans and animals, we take in oxygen from the air into our lungs, and our lungs expand, and we breathe it in. Another beautiful word to explain breathing in is inhaling. We inhale oxygen, and then we exhale or release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when we breathe out, so that there is a constant exchange of breathing in oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide. Now, plants, funny enough, do the opposite. Plants take in carbon dioxide into their leaves. So they take in carbon dioxide. They use carbon dioxide to then make their own food by a process called photosynthesis. Big word, but it is a cool word to say, photosynthesis. So they take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They use it to make their own food by a process called photosynthesis. They then, in making their own food, they also then release oxygen. And when they release oxygen, they release it into the atmosphere for then us, you and I, to then breathe in. So do you see how on this planet we need plants? We desperately need plants because plants are there to almost recycle the air. They need the carbon dioxide that we exhale. They use it to make food, and then we say excrete, because they get rid of the oxygen. They don't need oxygen. They don't want oxygen. They excrete oxygen, release oxygen into the atmosphere that we then take in. Right. Now moving on to the E of Mrs. Gren. The E stands for excretion. Now I know some of you are probably sitting there at home and you giving a little laugh or a little giggle, and that's okay. Remember, in science, we're going to be talking about all these words that sound silly, that you don't usually say on a daily basis, but excretion is natural and it is normal and it is essential for a living organism to be able to excrete. Now, I'm sure all of you possibly know what excretion means, but if you don't, the meaning of excretion is that all living things need to be able to get rid of excess water and waste products. So anything in the body or in that living organism that they don't need anymore, it doesn't serve a purpose for them, they then have to release it. Okay. Now with humans and animals have to get rid of, and when we say get rid of, a better scientific word is excrete. They excrete waste products from their bodies. There are special organs in the body which help to get rid of waste, such as the lungs, kidneys, and skin. I bet you didn't know that. There are also There are also other organs in the body that is also used to help excrete. So for example, our lungs. Now, did you know that, as I mentioned earlier, that we breathe in oxygen and then we release carbon dioxide? Now, we don't need carbon dioxide in our bodies. So we also say that we excrete carbon dioxide. Remember, the word excretion is getting rid of waste products that we don't need anymore. They don't serve a purpose. So that is another way. Now you must be probably thinking, sure, Miss Kun, but how on earth do plants excrete? So let's have a look. So plants, we say they excrete oxygen into the atmosphere. Remember, plants are opposite to us. They take in the carbon dioxide, and then using photosynthesis, they then create oxygen, but then they don't need oxygen, so they excrete oxygen. They also excrete waste water through a process called transpiration. Now, I'm not going to go into detail with transpiration. It is a process by which plants excrete excess water, and you can see with the picture here at the bottom of your slide, of the screen should I say, the little water droplets on the leaves, and that is a plant's way of excreting wastewater. Moving on, the very last letter of Mrs. Gren is N for nutrition. So in order for a living organism to be classified as living, it has to be able to take in food of some kind. So food is used by living things to give them the energy to do the usual things. Remember, we cannot function without food, because food is there to give us energy, and we need energy to be able to grow, to move, to excrete, to respire, all of those things. So nutrition is quite an important one. Now, we all know that humans and animals, we eat other plants and we get our energy from the plants, or we eat other animals. So some of you that do eat meat and fish, you will also get energy from meat and fish and other animals on our planet. Either we have herbivores that only eat plants, or we have omnivores that eat both plants and animals, or we have carnivores that eat just meat and just other animals, such as your lions and your leopards and so on. But your different classes of animals we'll get into at a much later stage. Now plants, interestingly enough, green plants make their own food. Now, before you look at the slide, who can remember what that process is called? I know some of you already saw it. It is photosynthesis. So they make their own food by photosynthesis. And by making their own food, they then use that, and the food is then travels to different parts of the plant where the plant actually needs it. Because remember, the plants they don't have mouths and they don't have digestive systems and so on like what we do. So plants actually have to make their own food. I know that some of you are probably giggling because you're probably thinking of an image of a plant with its own mouth and digestive system and teeth and whatnot. I can be silly sometimes. Okay, right. So before we go on to this vital question that is in front of you, just to recap Mrs. Gren, remember, an organism can only be classified as living or non-living, or should I say, an organism can only be classified as living if it follows the principle of Mrs. Gren. An organism has to be able to move. It has to be able to reproduce. An organism has to be able to be sensitive, has to be able to grow. An organism has to be able to respire. An organism has to be able to excrete as well as eat and have nutrition. So those 7 processes of life. Okay, so I'm going to pose a question to you. Are seeds living or are they non-living? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to quickly think about it. Are seeds living or are they non-living? What do you think? Ready to take a look? Right, let's have a look. So, did you know that seeds are actually alive? We do classify seeds as living. Now, you're probably thinking, but Ms. Kuhn, how on earth? Seeds don't move. They're not growing just yet. So, we actually classify seeds as, they are called, we say that they are in a dormant, or shall I say sleeping state almost. And will stay in a dormant state or a sleeping state until they're able to be revived. Now, when I say the word revive, I'm meaning that until seeds get air, water, sunlight, and are placed in soil to be able to germinate and grow, they then almost wake up and then they start growing. So seeds are classified as alive and they are living. Now, do you want to know an interesting fact? Did you know that fertilized eggs need to be kept warm or they won't hatch? This is why a mother bird will start sitting on her eggs to keep them warm when she has laid all of them. So remember that especially the eggs that we eat, the chicken eggs that we eat, chicken eggs in order for chicken eggs to be in order for the chicken eggs to hatch and then for little chicks to hatch out of these eggs, that's why mother hens need to sit on these eggs, keep them nice and warm in order for them to start hatching, right? And so if we take them away and the eggs are not kept warm after a certain period of time, that's why our eggs won't start to develop into chicks. So that is a very interesting fact. So are eggs living? Non-living. They are living. Okay, right. Now, the other question that some children usually ask is, Ms. Kuhn, then how do we get from then living to non-living? And if we look at certain things and we classify, but this organism was once alive, so then what category do we put it in? So let's have a look. Living things can become non-living when they die. So something that was once alive, after it dies, we then classify it as non-living. But more specifically, we don't necessarily just say it is non-living. We say that it is once lived, which means it is what was once alive. Okay, so I've got a few examples that I just want to go through. So the first one dropped down already. And that is a slab of wood or a piece of wood that you would often find on your desk at school, or a piece of wood, maybe furniture in your house. Now, wood, you all know, comes from trees. And you probably think, okay, so trees we know would be classified as living because trees perform all the 7 life processes in order to classify it as living. But now, this piece of wood has been cut from a tree. It's probably been varnished and sanded, and it looks beautiful. Or this piece of wood is part of your furniture in your house. So now, wood and furniture, we then classify it as once lived. Okay, nothing has been done to the wood. We haven't done anything apart from just treated it. So we do still classify it as that it was once alive. Right. Secondly, if we have a dead insect or a dead organism or a dead animal, something that has now completed its circle of life, we also classify it as once lived. It's no longer living anymore. But we do not say it's non-living because it was once alive and it did once upon a time perform all the 7 life processes. So now we say it is once lived. Thirdly, if we have, say, dead flowers. So you all know the beautiful roses and daisies and flowers in the garden, or you see on the streets or in parks. Flowers are beautiful, but when you pick flowers and you put them in a vase, for example, flowers only last a certain period of time, and eventually they also start to die. And we said those flowers were also once alive. And lastly, fossils. Now, fossils I find are really cool because fossils tell you a great deal about how living organisms how they once lived many years ago. So fossils, even though they are dead now, they've been beautifully preserved in rocks, and so fossils were also once alive. Okay, I hope that answers some of your questions. Now, we are going to do a little activity together. And as you can see, there are a few pictures on the screen, and we are going to then categorize these pictures and these images according to the 4 categories. Is that picture living? Is that organism living? Was it once alive? Was it once lived? Can it be revived? Remember our example. And lastly, has that organism never lived? Is it non-living? Right, are you ready? I'm actually going to give you a couple of seconds for you to have a look at the pictures, and if you could put them in the particular category or in their column according to where you think they should fit, where do you think it'll go? 3, 2, 1, go. Are you ready? Need a little bit longer? No, I know you've got it. You're far too clever. Let's go. Okay, so we're going to start off with the car. The car, we know, is never lived. A car is a manufactured item or manufactured product. So we say a car is never lived. It is not alive. Yes, a car moves, like Mrs. Gren. Okay, so it does move. The R for reproduction. Can a car reproduce? No. So far a car can move, so it does have fit one of the processes. The R for reproduction, no. S is a car sensitive. Does a car react to changes in its external environment? Not so much. If the weather is really cold, sometimes the engines can freeze, but I'm not going to go too much into detail with that. Does a car grow? No. Does a car respire? So does it excrete? Does it let out air? We can say yes, the fumes from a car. So we say yeah, we can say a car respires. Does a car excrete? We can say a car excretes those fumes that it gives off. And does a car need nutrition? Does it need in order to move? We can say that if you use petrol, for example. So yes, I would say a car can perform 4 of the 7. But because it's not 7 out of 7, it's not living. Okay. The next one I'm going to talk about is the eggs. Now, if those of you that paid attention and you focused, we spoke about the eggs can be revived. Eggs need warmth. And when eggs have the warmth and they are nice and warm, they start to grow into embryos and little chicks start to hatch. Then the dog, I'm sure the dog is an easy one. The dog we will classify as living. Then fourthly, our tree, as mentioned earlier, our tree would be classified as living as well, because it performs all the 7 essential life processes. Then our fifth picture is paper. Now, some of you probably think, well, okay, so what is paper? Is paper living? Can't be. Was paper once lived? Can it be revived, or is it non-living? Now, paper is different to a piece of wood. A piece of wood hasn't been sort of manufactured in a way that it's changed the texture and things have been added and whatnot. And so paper, yes, paper is made from trees, but remember, paper is also, there's other things that are added in order to make paper. And so paper, we then classify it as non-living, right? And then lastly, you can see the skull of a buck of some kind. I'm not too clued up on my bucks and antelope and whatnot, so we know that it is a skull of a creature, and we know that creature was once alive, and so we will classify it as once alive, and it lived once upon a time. I hope that you enjoyed that activity, and you are more than welcome to play this video again and to test yourself again, or go around your house and sit and have a look go outside your house, look at your plants, look at the birds that are flying past, look at things around you, and see if you can also categorize certain objects around your house according to whether it's alive, whether it was once alive, whether it can be revived, or whether it is non-living completely. Right, grade 4s, I hope that you have really enjoyed this session. I have absolutely loved teaching you. Remember that this lesson was brought to you by WorksheetCloud. And if you have any questions, remember to email your questions to grade4@worksheetcloud.com. Now, before I end off, I want to tell you one of my favorite sayings in life, and you'll see why it's my favorite. So you'll remember this with me. I always say Hakuna Matata. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard that from The Lion King, but why I love it the best is that it's actually got my surname, Kun, in Hakuna Matata. Get it? And because it's my favorite, it means no worries. So we can't change what happened yesterday. We can only focus on now and get excited for the future. We also don't know what the future has told. So don't worry, Hakuna Matata. Be kind to one another. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you soon.